I'm a 27-year-old man, married to my 26-year-old wife. We've always had a very honest and open relationship, one that works because we're transparent with each other about our desires, our boundaries, and our choices. And one of those choices, though not for everyone, is that we live a swinger lifestyle. We don't advertise it, but it's not something we're ashamed of either. We keep our profile online private, faceless, and discreet, just enough to connect with people who share the same interests. My wife and I were always on the same page about this. What we do together. No secrets, no lies, no stepping outside of the boundaries we agreed upon. For years, that worked for us. Until recently, when something happened that turned our entire world upside down. Because somehow, in the strangest and most uncomfortable twist I could have imagined, my own sister and her husband found our profile. At first, it didn't feel real. I thought maybe there was some mistake, some misunderstanding. But there wasn't. They recognized tattoos in our photos. And from there, things spiraled in a direction I never expected. My sister, who's 26, and her husband, who's 25, had just moved back to our town. My parents live here too, though we all have separate houses. At first, it felt nice. Family was close again, and I assumed it would mean more support, more connections, more family dinners, and stronger bonds. But instead, it led to something that nearly tore us apart. See, I work for an airline, which means I'm often away for a few days at a time. That's where things started to go wrong. One day, while I was out on a trip, my sister called my wife. She asked a simple question. Is he home? My wife told her I was still away, and then my sister casually suggested that she and her husband grab lunch with my wife. Now, you have to understand something about my wife. She's sweet, caring, and often assumes the best in people. When my sister asked her to lunch, my wife's first thought wasn't anything suspicious. It was that maybe my sister was pregnant again and needed support. It wouldn't have been surprising. This would have been their second child, and considering how unstable their finances already were, it made sense that she might want to confide in someone privately before telling everyone else. So my wife agreed. Lunch with my sister and her husband. Just a casual get-together, or so she thought. But when they sat down at the table, it didn't take long for things to take a sharp, uncomfortable turn. At first, my sister and her husband danced around the topic. But then they admitted it. They had found our profile. They had seen our photos. They had recognized us. My wife froze. It was already awkward enough. But then came the next part. The part that crossed a line so deep that she still panics when she remembers it. They didn't just admit to finding the profile. They started complimenting her. Saying how sexy she looked, saying how they had been staring at her pictures. My brother-in-law even admitted to getting off to them multiple times. Imagine being my wife in that moment. She thought she was walking into a family lunch, maybe a pregnancy announcement, maybe just bonding. Instead, she was suddenly sitting across from my sister and brother-in-law as they openly sexualized her, confessed their attraction, and even hinted at wanting to involve her in something that should never have been suggested. And just when my wife thought it couldn't get worse, it did. They didn't just stop at complimenting her. They pushed further. They said things like, well, we'd definitely feel more comfortable exploring this lifestyle if it was with someone we knew. And then, it would be so fun to do it behind his back. Behind my back. They laughed as they said it, as if betraying me, their own family, would somehow be part of the excitement. Then they started insulting me. My body. My personality. Joking about how I'd never know, how it would be so easy, how it would be thrilling. My wife sat there, stunned, shocked, frozen between wanting to leave and not knowing how to react. Her nervous laugh slipped out, the kind of awkward laugh people have when they're overwhelmed and don't know what else to do. But that laugh only encouraged them. They mistook it as interest, as consent. So they pushed harder. And as my wife waited desperately for the waiter to return her card so she could pay and leave, they leaned in closer, whispering fantasies of betraying me together. My own sister and her husband. That was the breaking point. The moment my wife realized she had to escape. As soon as the waiter returned, she rushed out, heart pounding, sick to her stomach. And the moment she was outside, she called me. Her voice was shaking. She was panicking. She spilled everything, every detail, as tears filled her words. And when I heard it, I felt something break inside of me. That was the beginning. But it was only the start of a much bigger fallout. Because once I got home, things only got worse. When I got home from my trip, the weight of what had happened was already crushing us. My wife had replayed the lunch over and over in her head, and by the time I walked through the door, she was in the middle of a full-blown panic attack. She couldn't catch her breath, her chest was tight, her hands were trembling, and between gasps, she told me everything again. Every disgusting word they had said, every insult they had thrown at me, every inappropriate thing my sister and her husband had suggested. And listening to it while holding her in my arms, I can't describe the mix of rage and heartbreak that tore through me. The very first thing I did was pull out my phone. I texted my sister directly. I didn't try to sugarcoat it. I told her she had crossed a line that should never be crossed. I told her and her husband that they were not to contact my wife ever again. And then my wife blocked them on everything: calls, texts, social media. Every door closed. But here's the thing. It didn't feel like enough. Because even after the blocking, even after drawing the boundary, there was still this sickening truth in the air. That my own sister, my flesh and blood, had betrayed me. And that betrayal wasn't just personal. It had consequences that stretched into my entire family. You see, my parents are divorced, but we still spend most holidays together. Birthdays, dinners, even casual game nights. My sister and her husband were always part of those gatherings. And now, after what happened, everything had changed. How could we sit at the same table again? How could my wife feel safe in a room with them? How could I look my sister in the eyes knowing what she tried to do behind my back? That's when I made another decision. One that would shatter the illusion of normal family life. I called my parents, both of them, separately, and I told them everything. Now, here's where the story gets even messier. Telling them what happened wasn't just about protecting my wife. It was also about explaining why we wouldn't be at family events anymore if my sister and her husband were present. But in order to explain the situation fully, I had to reveal something else, that my wife and I are swingers. This wasn't something I had planned on telling my parents. It was personal, private, and frankly, none of their business. But now, it was tied to the situation in a way that couldn't be ignored. So I told them. I laid it all out. Our lifestyle, our choices, and how my sister and her husband had not only discovered it, but tried to exploit it in the worst possible way. The reactions were complicated. There was shock, of course. Silence on the other end of the phone. A long pause before the question started. My mom wanted to understand how this even happened. My dad wanted to know if I was sure I wasn't misinterpreting things. But the one thing they both agreed on was that my sister had gone way too far. That what she did was unacceptable. That crossing into someone else's marriage, her own brother's marriage, was not just inappropriate, it was unforgivable. It was validating to hear them say it, but it didn't erase the pain. Because here's the truth. Even if everyone agrees she was wrong, it doesn't magically repair the damage. It doesn't erase the memory of my wife sitting across that table, hearing my own sister sexualize her, laugh about betraying me, and insult me to my face when I wasn't even there. For the next few days, the house was heavy with silence. My wife was distant, replaying the lunch again and again in her head. I could see the guilt eating at her. Even though she had done nothing wrong, she kept saying things like, maybe I shouldn't have agreed to lunch. Maybe I should have walked out sooner. Maybe I shouldn't have laughed. It made it worse. And every time, I had to remind her, this isn't your fault. She was ambushed, manipulated, cornered. She was put in an impossible situation where people she thought were family turned into predators. The responsibility doesn't fall on her. It falls squarely on them. But while I was reassuring her, I was also struggling with my own storm of emotions. Anger at my sister for betraying me. Disgust at my brother-in-law for admitting he'd been pleasuring himself to photos of my wife. Sadness that the family bond one once valued was now shattered. And fear that this incident would leave scars on my marriage that couldn't be healed. Because no matter how strong we were, no matter how much trust we had built, this wasn't just a small crack. It was a deep wound. And I couldn't help but wonder, what comes next? Would my parents be able to forgive her? Would family gatherings turn into battles? Would my wife ever feel safe again? Or was this the beginning of a permanent divide, a line that once crossed can never be uncrossed? That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't just end when the moment ends. It lingers. It poisons everything. It makes you question what you thought was safe, what you thought was sacred, what you thought was unbreakable. And for me, it wasn't just about losing trust in my sister. It was about realizing that sometimes the people you think you know best are capable of the darkest things. And once you see that side of them, you can't unsee it. The days after everything came out were some of the hardest I've ever faced. You see, betrayal isn't something you can process in one night. It doesn't fade away after one conversation, or even after a dozen reassurances. It lingers quietly, like a shadow that follows you around no matter how much light you try to bring into the room. For my wife, that shadow showed up in the form of nightmares. She'd wake up in the middle of the night shaking, sometimes even crying, mumbling about the lunch, about the words they said, about the feeling of being cornered. For me, the shadow took the shape of silence. I found myself staring at walls, lost in thought, asking myself questions that had no answers. Why would my own sister do this? Why would she try to destroy the trust between me and my wife? And what does it say about the family I thought I knew? When we finally sat down to talk, not just about the event itself, but about how to move forward, it wasn't easy. My wife felt guilty for laughing during the lunch, even though it was nervous laughter, the kind that slips out when you're uncomfortable and don't know what else to do. She kept saying, "I think they took it as encouragement. I think I made it worse." And I kept repeating the truth. It wasn't your fault. But here's the painful reality. Even when you know something isn't your fault, the guilt doesn't always disappear. It lingers. It digs its claws in. And it takes time, sometimes a long time, to heal. Meanwhile, my parents were trying to mediate, if you can call it that. Both of them called me, separately, asking if there was any way to move past this. My mom said, "She's still your sister. Family is family. Maybe she made a mistake, but can't you just forgive her?" And my dad, he took a different angle. He said, "I'm not excusing her, but maybe they were just curious. Maybe they didn't mean to cross a line as badly as they did." And listening to those words, I realized something. People will bend over backwards to protect the idea of family. Even when that family is toxic. Even when the wounds are still fresh. Even when forgiveness isn't possible. But I wasn't willing to bend. Not this time. I told them both, clearly, if my sister and her husband are at family events, we won't be there. I won't put my wife in that position again. I won't expose her to people who mocked me and tried to break our marriage. That's not negotiable. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a boundary. A hard line. One that had to be drawn, even if it meant I'd lose parts of my family in the process. Because when it comes down to it, protecting my wife and our marriage matters more than keeping the illusion of happy family gatherings. And yet that decision came with its own pain. Because suddenly, the holidays didn't feel like holidays anymore. Birthdays weren't the same. Game nights weren't the same. Everything that once felt normal was now tainted by the absence of something, or rather, someone. I'd scroll through social media and see pictures of my parents, my sister, and her husband together, smiling like nothing had happened. Pretending like they hadn't crossed one of the worst lines imaginable. And every time I saw those pictures, it felt like being punched in the chest. Because it was a reminder that while they might be able to move on and pretend, I couldn't. Not when my wife was still waking up from nightmares. Not when I could still hear the disgust in their voices, mocking me behind my back. One night, my wife asked me something that stopped me in my tracks. She said, "What if they try to talk to us again? What if your sister apologizes? What then?" I didn't have an answer at first. Because forgiveness is complicated. On one hand, I was raised to believe in second chances, in mending fences, in giving people the opportunity to make things right. On the other hand, how do you forgive someone who didn't just hurt you, but actively tried to break apart your marriage? After a long pause, I finally said, if they ever apologize, it won't erase what they did. It won't mean we let them back into our lives. It'll just mean we can close the chapter without carrying the weight of their betrayal forever. And she nodded. Because that's the thing about betrayal. You can forgive from a distance. But that doesn't mean you ever have to let the betrayer back into your circle again. The more time passed, the more I realized how deep the cracks were. My wife wasn't just shaken. She was different. She was quieter, more cautious. She second-guessed herself in conversations, worried that something she said might be taken the wrong way. And when we went out in public, she'd scan the room, making sure we wouldn't run into them. It broke my heart to see her like that. Because this wasn't the woman I married, the one who was confident, vibrant, full of laughter. This was someone scarred by betrayal, someone forced to carry weight that never should have been hers. And I knew, as her husband, it was my job to help her find her way back to herself. But I also knew that journey wouldn't be easy. And so I made a vow to myself that no matter what it took, no matter how long it took, I'd protect her. I'd put her first. I'd rebuild whatever trust, whatever security had been shaken by my sister and her husband's actions. Because at the end of the day, our marriage is worth fighting for. Our love is worth more than their betrayal. And while I can't control what my sister chooses to do, I can control this. She doesn't get to define our story. She doesn't get to decide who we are. We do. The weeks turned into months, and while life on the surface started to look normal again, beneath it all, the tension never really went away. Everyday routines felt heavier. Breakfast at the kitchen table wasn't just breakfast anymore. It was a silent reminder of what had been lost. Family dinners with my parents weren't the same. Invitations to gatherings came with a hidden weight, the knowledge that we'd either have to decline or face the possibility of running into my sister and her husband. It's strange how betrayal changes not just the people involved, but the spaces around them. Places that once felt safe suddenly felt unsafe. Moments that once felt warm suddenly carried a chill. My wife tried her best to move forward. She went back to her hobbies, spent more time with friends, even started journaling as a way to process her feelings. But I could see it, she wasn't the same. When she smiled, it didn't quite reach her eyes. When she laughed, there was a hesitation, like a shadow standing behind her joy. And sometimes, late at night, I'd catch her staring off into space, lost in thoughts she couldn't put into words. I asked her once what she was thinking. She said quietly, "I keep replaying it. Their faces. Their words. The way they looked at me. I can't stop wondering why. Why they would do that." And I didn't have an answer. Because, honestly, I was asking myself the same question every single day. The hardest part, though, wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the ripple effect. See, betrayal doesn't happen in isolation. It spreads. It touches everything around it. It changes relationships in ways you don't expect. My relationship with my parents, for example, was permanently altered. They kept trying to convince me to reconcile, to make peace for the sake of family unity. But every time they said those words, it felt like they were minimizing what had happened. Like they were asking me to sweep it under the rug, as if betrayal could be erased by pretending it didn't exist. I started calling them less, visiting less, because every interaction turned into a subtle argument about forgiveness, about family, about why I couldn't just move on. But here's the thing, moving on doesn't mean pretending it never happened. Moving on means accepting that it did happen and making choices to protect yourself from it ever happening again. And that's exactly what I was trying to do. There were moments when I questioned myself, though. I'd wonder if I was being too harsh, too stubborn, too unforgiving. Was I overreacting? Was I letting anger cloud my judgment? But then I'd remember the way my wife's voice shook when she told me what they said at lunch. I'd remember the panic in her eyes as she replayed it all, over and over. I'd remember the way she held me in the kitchen that night, trembling, saying, "I don't feel safe around them." And in those moments, the doubt disappeared. Because protecting her wasn't an overreaction, it was the only reaction that made sense. But the emotional weight was real. One evening, I came home from work to find her sitting on the floor in our living room, surrounded by old photo albums. Pictures of us with my sister, with my parents, with a family before everything fell apart. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and asked, "Do you think it'll ever go back to how it used to be?" And my heart broke, because the truth was something neither of us wanted to admit. No, it would never be the same again. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together. Not fully. Not the way they were before. Still, we try to find a new normal. We created new traditions, weekend trips, spontaneous date nights, movie marathons at home. We focused on building our own little world, separate from the chaos of extended family. And slowly, in those small moments, we found a sense of peace. But even then, the shadows lingered. There were times when the phone would buzz and my wife would flinch, half expecting it to be my sister somehow trying to reach out. There were holidays where we sat alone, feeling the weight of absence. There were nights when silence filled the air heavier than words ever could. And yet, through it all, we held on to each other. Because that's the thing about love. It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives you the strength to carry it. As more time passed, I started to notice something unexpected. The betrayal, as painful as it was, had forced us to grow stronger together. It stripped away illusions, forced us to have harder conversations, and reminded us of what really mattered. We stopped taking each other for granted. We became more intentional in how we loved, how we listened, how we protected each other. In a strange way, their attempt to break us only made us more unbreakable. But even with that strength, even with that growth, one truth remained. Forgiveness didn't come easy. And maybe it never would. Because forgiveness isn't just about saying the words, it's about rebuilding trust. And trust once shattered is one of the hardest things in the world to restore. So, I decided to stop forcing it. I stopped worrying about whether I'd ever forgive my sister or her husband. I stopped trying to figure out if reconciliation was possible. Instead, I focused on what I could control: loving my wife, protecting our marriage, and building a future that didn't include people who tried to destroy it. And in that choice, I found freedom. Life settled into a fragile rhythm. The new normal we had carved out felt safe, but safe didn't mean easy. Every day carried its own reminders of what had happened, little triggers that would pull our hearts back into the chaos we had survived. We learned to celebrate victories differently. Instead of large family gatherings, we focused on small wins, like a quiet Saturday morning with coffee on the balcony, or the rare evening when we cooked together without an argument. These moments felt monumental because they were ours alone. I noticed subtle changes in my wife's behavior. She became more cautious, more guarded, not just with people outside, but even with me at times. I knew it wasn't about mistrust toward me. It was about the trauma lingering in her mind. She would sometimes pause mid-conversation, looking as if she were about to say something and then thinking better of it. She would check the locks on doors multiple times at night. Every phone notification made her flinch. And I realized healing doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't obey rules. It doesn't happen neatly. We also started therapy together. At first, it felt awkward, like airing the rawest parts of our lives to a stranger, but gradually, it became a sanctuary. Talking openly about our fears, our anger, and the subtle ways the incident had shifted our world helped us understand each other better. I began to see the ways I had unconsciously tried to shield myself from the truth. My wife began to recognize the ways she had internalized guilt and anxiety that were not hers to carry. Therapy wasn't magic, but it was a roadmap, a guide to navigating a landscape permanently altered by betrayal. Family holidays remained a challenge. We avoided gatherings where my sister and her husband might be present. Invitations were politely declined. Social circles adjusted. People noticed the distance, asked questions, and we gave vague answers, protective ones. It wasn't about revenge or anger anymore. It was about boundaries, about protecting the life we were trying to rebuild, about making sure our happiness wasn't jeopardized by people who had already caused immense pain. And yet, life has a strange way of throwing curveballs. A month after avoiding yet another holiday dinner, my sister reached out. Not to apologize, not to mend bridges, but to try and explain. She sent a long message, outlining her perspective, justifying her actions, even suggesting that things got out of hand, and we were only curious. I read it once, then again. My stomach churned. Anger, disbelief, and the residual hurt came flooding back. My wife read it over my shoulder and shook her head.
No.
No contact. Not now, not ever, she said firmly. And I agreed. Our focus remained inward, on each other. The future we were building was delicate, and we couldn't risk letting old wounds open again. And slowly, we began to reclaim parts of life that felt lost. We found joy in mundane things: a sunny morning run, a favorite song on the radio, the sound of children playing in the neighborhood park. We found laughter again. Quiet, unhurried laughter that reminded us there was still light in our world. But underlying it all was awareness. Awareness that life could be unpredictable, that people could be manipulative, that trust is precious, and once broken, it leaves a mark. We learned to listen, not just hear, to observe, not just look, to protect, not just exist. And in that awareness, we discovered strength. Strength that didn't come from revenge or anger, but from the quiet decision to keep moving forward together, no matter what. To this day, the experience shapes us. Not in overt ways, but subtly, like roots beneath the soil, holding the tree upright through storms. We became more selective with trust, more intentional with our actions, and more aware of how fragile happiness can be. And while the pain never fully disappears, it becomes manageable. It becomes a reminder, a teacher, if you will, of how resilient love can be when both partners choose to protect it. As I sat there trying to process everything, my mind was spinning. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My sister and her husband had crossed boundaries I never thought they would, and my wife had been put in an incredibly uncomfortable position. I could see the fear and confusion on her face, and it made my stomach churn. I kept thinking about the lunch, the awkward laughs, the way they had made it seem almost casual while simultaneously making cruel comments about me. It wasn't just a simple curiosity about our lifestyle. They had intentionally tried to lure her into something behind my back. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. We spent the evening talking, trying to untangle the mess. My wife was shaken, and I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and a deep need to protect her. It was difficult to put into words how violated we both felt, not physically, but emotionally. Trust, respect, and boundaries were supposed to be clear among all of us, and yet here we were, dealing with a situation that crossed every line. I decided I had to take action immediately. I called my sister and her husband, firmly stating that what they did was unacceptable. I told them that neither of them should contact my wife again, and that if they did, it would be considered harassment. I could hear a defensive tone in my sister's voice, but I didn't let it deter me. I made it crystal clear, this stops now. After hanging up, I turned to my wife and held her hand. I wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that I had her back no matter what. She had blocked them on all platforms, and I encouraged her to continue doing so. I also felt that we needed to inform our parents. It wasn't easy because our family dynamics were complex and sharing details about our lifestyle was sensitive. But given the circumstances, it was necessary for them to understand what had happened, especially since holidays and family events could now be compromised. We spent hours discussing boundaries, safety, and how to protect ourselves moving forward. It was exhausting emotionally, but necessary. By the end of the night, I felt a small sense of relief. We had confronted the situation head-on, set clear boundaries, and reaffirmed our trust in each other. That night, lying in bed, I realized just how much this incident had tested us. But I also understood something crucial. Our connection, though tested, was stronger because we chose honesty, communication, and mutual respect. Next morning, we woke up with a heavy but determined feeling. The events of yesterday were still fresh, and I could see the stress lingering in my wife's eyes. I reminded her that we had handled the situation with clarity and firmness. She nodded, and for the first time since the lunch incident, I saw a flicker of relief. We discussed the practical steps to avoid further issues. Our devices were secured, passwords updated, and contact with my sister and her husband was completely cut off. We agreed on boundaries that were non-negotiable. No future contact without explicit consent. It was about protecting our marriage and mental peace. Later, we called our parents individually to explain the situation. It was awkward but necessary. We shared just enough information so they understood the seriousness without oversharing intimate details. They were shocked but supportive. They promised to respect our choices and not bring any tension into family gatherings. This gave us a sense of security that we hadn't realized we were missing. Over the next few days, my wife and I spent quality time reconnecting. Simple routines, making breakfast together, long walks, laughing over inside jokes, helped mend the emotional strain. I noticed her smile returning, her laughter feeling more genuine. We were healing, not just from the incident, but from the underlying fear that had built up. The incident also made me reflect on trust and communication. Our lifestyle choices required honesty and boundaries, and yesterday reminded me how vital it was to reinforce those. I promised myself to be even more attentive, to check in regularly with my wife emotionally, and to ensure our home remained a safe space. We also set future rules for our lifestyle exploration, only activities where both of us are fully comfortable, full transparency, and absolute respect for boundaries. No one else could breach the trust we had built, and we agreed to reinforce this consistently. That night, as we lay in bed, I held her hand and whispered how proud I was of how she handled everything. She squeezed my hand back, tears glistening, and said she felt safe because of our unity. In that moment, I realized that the strength of our marriage didn't come from what we experienced, but from how we faced it together. The lesson was clear. Boundaries, trust, and communication are the pillars that protect love. Anyone crossing those lines must be confronted immediately, and healing only happens when both partners stand together. We had navigated a storm, and on the other side, we were stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. The situation with my sister and her husband remained tense, but we no longer felt powerless. We reclaimed our peace, redefined our boundaries, and fortified the love that had already been tested. And in doing so, we learned that the real strength of any relationship is not in avoiding conflict, but in facing it head-on, together.